Hello there, how are you tonight? Imagine starting your day before the sun rises, not with quiet, but with heat, a steady, growing warmth, coming from a fire that never really seems to rest. The air feels heavy, thick with smoke, and something metallic, and with each movement, there's a weight to what you're about to do, because this isn't just work, it's repetition, effort, and a kind of physical strain that slowly builds over time. You lift, you strike, and you repeat the same motion. Again and again, not for minutes, but for hours, and while it may seem simple from a distance, there's a quiet intensity to it, a rhythm that demands focus, and a level of endurance that not everyone could maintain. This was the daily life of a medieval blacksmith, a role that was essential, respected, but far more demanding than most people realize. Before we step closer to the forge, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe if you enjoy these calm journeys, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always a little comforting seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's gently explore what it was really like to live and work as a blacksmith in the medieval world. Long before the village stirred awake, the blacksmith was already moving. The world outside remained dark, wrapped in the deep blue silence that comes just before dawn. Most homes still held sleeping families beneath wool blankets, tucked safely away from the cold. But inside the smithy, sleep had already become a memory. The forge waited, even after the fire had been allowed to die low during the night. Faint orange embers often remained buried beneath soft layers of grey ash. Like something alive, the fire never seemed completely gone. It only slept lightly, waiting for breath. The blacksmith would kneel beside the hearth, stiff from yesterday's labor, and begin the first task of the day, waking the fire. With rough hands darkened by soot, he would arrange fresh charcoal over the sleeping embers. Then slowly, deliberately, he would work the bellows, a long wooden arm pushed inward, then pulled back, inward, and back again. Each breath of the bellows fed the hidden coals below, and little by little the forge answered, first a glow, then a pulse, then flame. The light would flicker against the stone walls, stretching shadows across hanging tools that looked almost like silent figures watching from the dark, before a single word had been spoken that morning. The day had already begun with labor. That was one of the first truths of a blacksmith's life. The work did not begin with shaping iron, it began with preparing for it. Nothing in the workshop happened quickly. Every task demanded patience before it demanded strength. Heat had to be built carefully. Metal had to be judged by color. Tools had to be checked. Water barrels had to be filled. Ashes had to be cleared. Even silence itself felt busy. Outside, frost sometimes clung to the ground in winter. In summer, the early air could feel cool for only a short while before the forge overwhelmed it. No matter the season, the blacksmith's day began with fire, and once that fire was awake, it would remain hungry. As the flames strengthened, the room changed with them. Cold disappeared first, then comfort, then breath itself seemed different. The air became dry and heavy, carrying the scent of coal smoke mixed with old iron and damp stone. It settled into clothes, into skin, into hair. Even after leaving the workshop, a blacksmith often carried the smell of the forge with him, as though the fire refused to let go. By sunrise, the first customers might begin to arrive, a farmer needing a cracked plough repaired, a merchant with a bent hinge, a traveler whose horse had thrown a shoe somewhere on the road in darkness. The village depended on the man at the anvil long before many villagers even opened their shutters, and yet most of them never truly saw the beginning. They only saw the sparks later. They saw the hammer fall, they saw glowing metal bend, they saw useful things appear from fire, but they rarely saw the quieter part, the lonely hour before dawn. The moment when one tired man stood alone beside sleeping embers, preparing himself to do it all again, because blacksmithing was not simply a craft, it was a life measured in heat, in effort, and in mornings that always began before the light. And as the forge roared brighter in the darkness, the longest part of the day, had only just begun. By the time the first light of morning settles over the village, the forge is no longer alone. What began in silence now slowly gathers presence. Footsteps approach. Soft at first, then more certain, a figure passes by the doorway, then another, and soon, without announcement, life begins to form around the fire. The blacksmith rarely works in isolation for long. Even in the earliest hours, the workshop becomes a quiet center of movement, a place where needs are brought, and small problems are handed over in the form of worn metal. A farmer arrives first. As they often do, his boots carry traces of damp earth, still clinging from fields not yet warmed by the sun. In his hands, he holds a tool, something simple but essential. A cracked plow tip. Worn thin from repeated use, he does not rush forward. Instead, he pauses at the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim glow within. The forge light flickers against his face, reflecting softly in tired eyes that have already seen their share of early mornings. There is no need for many words, a nod, a quiet exchange, and the tool is placed gently nearby. The blacksmith understands. He always does. This quiet understanding is part of the life around the forge, an unspoken language built not from conversation, but from routine. Soon after, another arrives, a young boy this time, perhaps sent by someone else. He carries a bundle wrapped in cloth, careful not to drop it, as though the object inside holds more importance than its size suggests. When unwrapped, it reveals a simple iron hinge, bent out of shape, something from a door, or a chest, or a place meant to be kept closed. Again, few words, only the soft placing of the item, and a step backward. Around the edges of the workshop, life continues to gather. A traveler might appear next, their cloak still holding the dust of distant roads. A horse waits just outside, shifting its weight slowly, the faint sound of hooves pressing into the earth breaking the stillness. A missing horseshoe, a small problem, but one that cannot be ignored. Without it, the journey halts, and so the blacksmith's role stretches beyond the walls of the village, touching roads unseen, paths unknown, lives that pass through briefly and move on again. Inside, the space begins to feel smaller. Not from crowding, but from presence. People stand quietly along the walls, careful not to interfere. They watch, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet patience, because here, time moves differently. Nothing is rushed, nothing can be rushed. The forge decides the pace, and so they wait, listening to the gentle rise and fall of the bellows, watching the slow transformation of metal, feeling the warmth that fills the room like a second atmosphere. There is a rhythm to it all, not loud, not overwhelming, just steady, predictable, almost comforting. Outside, the village continues to wake. Distant sounds begin to form. A door opening, faint voices, the creak of wooden wheels somewhere along a narrow path. But inside the workshop, those sounds feel far away. Here, everything centers around the fire, and the man who tends it. Despite the presence of others, the blacksmith remains, in a way, alone. His focus rarely breaks. Each task requires attention that leaves little space for distraction. Even as people come and go, placing their needs within reach, he moves from one piece of metal to the next with a quiet determination. There is no performance, no display, only work, and yet, those who stand and watch often feel something more than simple observation. There is a subtle tension in the air, not discomfort, but awareness, an understanding that what happens here matters, that without this place, small things begin to fail. A broken tool becomes a lost harvest, a missing shoe becomes a halted journey, a bent hinge becomes a door that will not close. Each piece, no matter how small, carries weight, and so the forge becomes more than a workshop. It becomes a quiet center of dependence, a place where the village without fully realizing it. Slowly gathers its needs as the morning light grows stronger. It begins to slip through the doorway in soft, angled beams. Dust in the air becomes visible, drifting slowly. Catching the light in gentle motion, time passes. Though it is difficult to measure, the blacksmith continues, the people wait, and the fire remains constant, always present, always demanding, and as the line of quiet visitors forms and fades, one after another, a quiet truth settles in. Life around the forge is never still, but it is never hurried either. It moves in a slow, steady rhythm, one that the blacksmith must follow for the entire day. As the morning settles fully into day, the forge no longer feels like a source of warmth. It becomes something heavier, something constant. The fire, once gently awakened in the early hours, now stands fully alive, its glow no longer soft, but steady and demanding. It does not flicker uncertainly anymore. It breathes, and with each breath, the air inside the workshop begins to change. At first, it is subtle, a warmth along the hands, a slight dryness in the throat, but slowly, almost without notice, the heat begins to settle into everything, into the walls, into the tools, into the body itself. The blacksmith stands before the forge, his movements measured, deliberate. Each action draws him closer to the fire, and yet there is no hesitation in the way he works, because this heat is not optional, it is necessary. Without it, the metal remains unyielding, cold, resistant to change. Only through sustained fire does it begin to soften, to glow, to respond, and so the blacksmith remains where the heat is strongest, not stepping away, not seeking relief, but returning to it again and again. The bellows move steadily, inward and outward. Each push feeds the flames, causing them to surge with quiet intensity. The fire answers immediately, growing brighter, hotter, more consuming. It is a relationship built on control, but never complete control. Because fire, even when guided, never fully belongs to anyone. The air thickens, not just with heat, but with presence. Smoke rises in soft, twisting shapes, drifting upward before fading into the dim space above. It carries with it a scent that is difficult to ignore. A mixture of burning coal and heated iron. Sharp, dry, and lingering. Breathing becomes something more noticeable here. Each inhale feels warmer than the last, each exhale slower, heavier, and yet, the blacksmith continues. There is no pause for discomfort, no moment where the heat is questioned. It is simply part of the work, as expected as the tools themselves. The metal, now placed within the heart of the fire, begins its quiet transformation. At first, nothing seems to change, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, a dull red appears, faint, like the last light of a setting sun. But the blacksmith watches closely, because within that color lies meaning. Too dim, and the metal will resist. Too bright, and it risks becoming too soft, too fragile. There is a narrow moment, a precise point, where the metal is ready, and recognizing that moment requires more than sight. It requires familiarity, experience, and understanding built over years of watching fire behave in ways that never repeat exactly the same. The blacksmith reaches forward, quickly, but without haste. The heated iron is drawn from the forge, glowing now with a deeper intensity, casting soft light onto nearby surfaces. For a brief moment, it becomes the brightest thing in the room. Then, it meets the anvil. The first strike lands, not violently, but firmly. The sound rings out, clear, measured, echoing softly against the stone, and with it, a small burst of heat escapes into the air. Not visible, but felt, again. The hammer rises, again. It falls. Each strike pushes the metal further from what it was, and closer to what it needs to become. But with every movement, the heat remains. Unchanging, unforgiving, it presses against the skin, settles into muscles, wraps itself around the blacksmith like something that cannot be removed. Sweat forms quietly, not in sudden drops, but gradually, steadily, as though the body itself is learning to endure. Clothing grows heavier, hands grow warmer, time begins to blur. Inside the forge, hours do not pass in the same way they do outside. There is no breeze here and no shade, only fire, and the slow work it demands, even those who stand nearby, waiting patiently, begin to feel it. They shift slightly, step back when they can, but the blacksmith does not. He remains, because leaving the heat, even for a moment, means breaking the rhythm, and the rhythm, once lost, is difficult to find again. So he continues, returning each piece of metal to the fire, watching it change, shaping it, then returning it once more, over and over. The process does not end quickly. It stretches, repeats, builds, until the heat itself feels like part of the body, no longer something separate, but something carried. And as the fire burns steadily, without rest, a quiet realization begins to settle beneath the surface of it all. The greatest challenge is not learning how to use the fire, it is learning how to remain within it. As the heat settles into a steady, unchanging presence, and the rhythm of the forge continues without interruption, another layer of the blacksmith's world begins to reveal itself, not in movement, but in stillness, around the workshop. Resting patiently in shadow and light are the tools. At first glance, they seem simple, unmoving, silent, almost forgotten against the walls they hang upon, but each one carries purpose, and each one waits. The blacksmith does not reach for them all at once, he knows them too well for that. Instead, his hand moves with quiet certainty, selecting only what is needed. At the exact moment it is needed, closest to him stands the anvil. Heavy, grounded, unwavering, its surface bears the marks of years, small dents, shallow grooves, subtle imperfections that speak of countless strikes. It does not shine, it does not call attention to itself, and yet everything returns to it, every piece of iron, once heated, once softened, finds its way here. The anvil does not change, it receives, it endures, and in doing so, it becomes the center of transformation. Nearby, resting within reach, lies the hammer, not one, but several, each slightly different in weight, in shape, in balance. To an unfamiliar eye, they may seem nearly identical, but to the blacksmith, the difference is clear, one for shaping, one for flattening, one for more delicate work. He does not hesitate when choosing between them. His hand finds the correct tool without thought, as though the decision has already been made long before the moment arrives. This is not guesswork. It is familiarity, built slowly, over time, further along the wall. Long-handled tongs hang in quiet rows, their metal arms curve gently, designed to grip, to hold, to control what cannot be touched. Without them, the work would not simply be difficult, it would be impossible. And yet, even these tools demand care. A grip too loose, and the metal slips too tight, and control is lost. There is a balance in everything here, even in the smallest movements. In one corner of the workshop, a basin of water rests undisturbed, its surface still, reflecting faint light from the forge. At times, it seems almost out of place, a quiet pool within a space ruled by fire, but its role is just as important. When heated metal meets the water, there is a sudden change, a sharp sound. Brief and contained, steam rises quickly, then disappears. The transformation is immediate, irreversible. Fire shapes, water sets, both are needed, and the blacksmith moves between them. without pause, returning again to the walls. More tools reveal themselves slowly, files. Worn smooth from repeated use, chisels. Marked by careful strikes, small hammers. Heavier ones. Tools for bending. Tools for cutting. Tools for finishing. None of them are decorative, none of them exist without reason, each has been chosen, kept, and maintained, because it serves a purpose that cannot easily be replaced. Even the wooden handles show signs of time, polished not by design, but by touch, grip after grip, day after day, until the surface becomes smooth. Shaped by the hand that holds it, there is something quiet about this relationship between the blacksmith and the tools he uses. He does not speak to them, does not pause to admire them. And yet, there is trust, a silent understanding that each tool will respond exactly as expected, that it will not fail as long as it is treated with care. But this trust is not given freely, it is built, maintained, tested over time, a tool left unattended, a handle left to weaken, a surface left to wear too far. These small things carry consequences, and in a place where heat already demands constant attention, there is little room for error. Even the arrangement of the tools matters. Everything rests where it should, within reach. But never in the way, because in the rhythm of the forge, hesitation breaks flow, and flow, once broken, takes effort to restore, so the workshop remains ordered. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but purposefully. Every mark, every placement, tells a quiet story of use as the day continues. The tools move in and out of the blacksmith's hands, lifted, used, returned again and again, without thought, but never without intention, and slowly, almost without noticing, a realization begins to settle in. The blacksmith does not simply shape metal, he works in partnership with objects that demand just as much understanding as the fire itself. By now, the forge has settled into its steady breath, the tools have found their place, and the flow of work continues without interruption. But beneath that quiet rhythm, something begins to build, not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly and persistently. It begins in the body. At first, the movements feel natural. Lift the hammer, bring it down, guide the metal, return it to the fire, wait, watch, repeat. Each action follows the last with a quiet certainty. There is no confusion in the sequence, no hesitation, only motion. Familiar and practiced, but repetition has its own weight, and that weight does not arrive all at once. It gathers, strike by strike, movement by movement. The blacksmith does not notice it immediately. In the early hours, strength feels reliable. The arms respond without resistance. The hands grip firmly. The rhythm feels almost effortless, like something the body remembers on its own. But as time continues, that ease begins to change. The hammer feels slightly heavier on the return. The arm lingers just a moment longer before lifting again. The grip tightens, not by choice, but out of necessity. And still, the work does not stop, because the metal does not wait. Each piece demands attention while it is ready, too slow. And the heat fades, too hesitant. And the shape is lost, so the blacksmith continues, matching the rhythm. Even as the body begins to feel the strain, there is no clear moment where effort turns into exhaustion. Only a gradual shift, a quiet awareness that each movement now requires just a little more. The sound of the hammer becomes steady, almost hypnotic, not loud, not sharp, just consistent, a measured tone that fills the space between breaths. Strike, pause, strike, pause. It repeats with such regularity that it begins to feel less like sound and more like time itself, marking each passing moment. Without needing a clock, the blacksmith moves with it, not thinking in minutes, or hours, but in cycles: heat, shape, return, heat, shape, return, again, and with each cycle. The body adapts, muscles tighten, then loosen, then tighten again. The shoulders carry more than their share. The back remains steady, holding posture through long periods of stillness between movements, even the hands. Rough and accustomed. Begin to feel the repetition in subtle ways, a slight stiffness, a slower response, but never enough to stop, because stopping is not part of the rhythm. There is always another piece waiting, another tool to mend, another shape to finish. The line of work may grow shorter, then longer again, but it never fully disappears, and so the repetition continues. What makes it difficult is not just the physical effort, it is the sameness, the way each movement mirrors the last, until they begin to blend together, until the difference between one task and the next becomes harder to distinguish. There is no sudden change, no shift in pace, only continuity, a quiet, unbroken sequence of effort, and within that sequence, the mind must remain steady, focused, but not restless, attentive, but not distracted, because even in repetition, small details matter: a strike slightly off, a moment slightly delayed. These small things carry consequences, so the blacksmith cannot drift too far into thought, cannot allow the rhythm to become automatic. It must remain deliberate, controlled, even as it repeats. This balance between familiarity and attention is where the true weight begins to settle, not just in the body, but in the mind as well. The hours pass quietly, the forge continues, the tools return to motion. Again and again, and slowly. The repetition becomes something more than simple action, it becomes endurance. Not measured by strength alone, but by the ability to continue, without breaking the rhythm, because here, in the steady, unchanging flow of the forge, there is no final movement, no clear ending to the sequence, only the quiet understanding that the next strike will always follow the last. Long before the movements become steady, before the rhythm feels natural, before the body learns how to endure, there is a beginning, a quiet, uncertain beginning, not at the anvil, not with the hammer raised in confidence, but at the edge of the workshop, watching, listening, trying to understand something that does not easily explain itself. For those who step into this world for the first time, the forge can feel overwhelming, the heat immediate, the sounds unfamiliar, the pace difficult to follow. There is no clear instruction written into the air, no simple way to grasp what is happening all at once, only fragments, moments, small observations that slowly begin to connect. A young apprentice might stand just inside the doorway, hesitant to step further. The warmth reaches them first, followed by the scent of smoke and iron. Their eyes move across the space, taking in the anvil, the tools, the fire that seems alive in a way they have never seen before. At first, it is not skill they learn. It is awareness, where to stand, when to move, when to remain still. These things are not always spoken, they are understood through presence, through watching the blacksmith work without interruption, through noticing how each action follows another, how nothing is wasted, how even the smallest movement carries purpose. The apprentice does not begin by shaping metal, that comes much later. Instead, they begin with simpler tasks, carrying charcoal, sweeping ash, bringing water, small responsibilities, repeated often, until they no longer require thought. These tasks may seem distant from the craft itself, but they are not separate, they are the foundation, because before learning how to control metal, one must learn how to exist within the space where that control happens. The blacksmith does not offer constant guidance, there are no long explanations, only brief instructions, given when necessary. Watch closely. Not like that. Again. The words are few, but they carry weight, and over time, the apprentice begins to notice more, the way the fire changes color, the difference between a dull glow and a brighter one, the sound of the hammer. When it strikes correctly, the slight shift in posture that changes everything. These details are not obvious at first, they reveal themselves slowly, over days, over weeks, sometimes over years. Mistakes are part of the process. Small ones. At first, a misplaced tool, a delayed movement, a moment of hesitation. None of them are ignored, but neither are they treated with harshness, they are corrected quietly, because learning here is not about speed, it is about consistency, patience, understanding that skill does not arrive suddenly, it builds layer by layer, through repetition, through observation, through time. The apprentice watches as the blacksmith works without pause, sees how each piece of metal changes under careful effort, feels the rhythm, even before fully understanding it, and slowly, without realizing exactly when it happens, they begin to anticipate, to move slightly sooner, to prepare before being asked, to recognize what comes next, before it is spoken. This is where learning truly begins, not in instruction, but in recognition. The forge teaches in its own way, through heat, through timing, through consequence, and the blacksmith guides quietly within it, never rushing the process, never expecting perfection, only expecting presence, attention, willingness to continue, as the days pass. The apprentice steps closer to the work, closer to the fire, closer to the rhythm. The distance between watching and doing slowly disappears, but it never vanishes completely, because even after years, there is always more to understand, more to notice, more to refine, and so the craft remains not something that is simply learned, but something that is lived, one careful moment at a time. As the days begin to gather into weeks, and the unfamiliar slowly becomes recognizable, the role of the apprentice begins to change. What once felt distant, observed from the edges of the workshop, now moves closer to the center, not suddenly, not with ceremony, but through expectation. The blacksmith no longer needs to point toward every task. The apprentice has seen enough, repeated enough, to begin moving on their own. And with that quiet shift, comes a different kind of weight. In the early days, mistakes felt small, easily corrected, almost expected, but now they begin to carry more meaning. A tool placed in the wrong spot interrupts the rhythm, a delay in preparation causes the heat to fade. A moment of distraction becomes visible, not just to the apprentice, but to the work itself. There is still patience, still guidance, but there is also a growing understanding that presence alone is no longer enough. Now there must be contribution. The apprentice begins the day not by waiting, but by preparing. The forge must be ready before the blacksmith arrives at full work. Charcoal arranged, ash cleared, tools set in place, water basin filled, each task completed quietly, but with intention. There is a certain stillness in these early preparations. The workshop is not yet filled with visitors. The sounds are softer, more contained, and within that quiet, the apprentice works alone for brief moments, testing memory, replaying what has been seen before, hoping that nothing has been forgotten. When the blacksmith enters, there is no formal acknowledgement, only a glance, a subtle awareness of what has been done, and what has not. Approval is rarely spoken, but it is felt, in the absence of correction, in the continuation of work without interruption. This is how progress is measured here. Not through praise, but through quiet acceptance. As the day unfolds, the apprentice is given more responsibility, small at first, holding heated metal with tongs, while the blacksmith shapes it, passing tools at the right moment, without being asked, maintaining the fire, adjusting the bellows when needed. Each task requires attention, timing, confidence, and yet confidence does not come easily. The heat feels closer now, more present. the consequences of hesitation more immediate. A poorly held piece of iron can slip, a delayed movement can disrupt the rhythm. The apprentice learns quickly. Not through instruction, but through experience, through feeling the near miss. The slight error, the quiet correction that follows. There is no harshness, but there is no escape from the lesson either, because the forge responds to every action, every choice, and so learning continues. In a deeper way, not just through observation, but through participation, the apprentice begins to understand the weight of timing, the importance of anticipation, the subtle signals that guide the work, a shift in the blacksmith's posture, a change in the sound of the hammer, the color of the metal. Just before it is ready, these details are no longer distant. They are immediate, necessary. The workshop itself begins to feel different, less overwhelming, but more demanding. What once felt like a place to watch, now feels like a place to perform. Quietly. Without error, even the presence of others. The villagers who come and wait feels different now. Their needs are no longer distant. The apprentice begins to recognize them. The farmer who returns, the traveler with worn equipment, the familiar faces. Carrying familiar problems, and with that recognition comes a subtle awareness that the work matters, not in a distant way, but in a direct, immediate one. The apprentice is no longer outside the process, they are part of it. And with that, the pressure grows, not loud, not overwhelming, but constant, a quiet expectation. Carried through each task, through each moment of attention, through each movement that must be made correctly, without hesitation, as the day continues. The apprentice grows more steady, more certain, but never fully at ease, because the work does not allow for complete comfort. There is always something to watch, something to anticipate, something to improve, and so the early training continues. Not as a single phase, but as an ongoing process, one that does not end quickly, one that shapes not just skill, but discipline, awareness, endurance, and as the forge burns steadily, and the rhythm continues without pause, the apprentice begins to understand that learning this craft is not about reaching a moment of mastery, but about remaining within the process for as long as the fire continues to burn. As the days pass and the rhythm of the forge becomes familiar, the body begins to understand something the mind cannot fully prepare for. The work is not simply learned, it is carried. At first, the effort feels manageable, even for the apprentice, whose movements are still careful, still measured. There is a sense of progress. Muscles respond quickly. Energy feels available. Each task, though unfamiliar, seems possible, but the forge does not measure effort in moments, it measures it in duration, and over time. That duration begins to reveal itself. The blacksmith stands as he always has. Steady before the anvil, his posture unchanged. His movements consistent from the outside. There is little sign of strain, no sudden pauses, no visible hesitation, only the same repeated motion. Carried forward without interruption, but beneath that stillness, there is effort, constant, unrelenting. The hammer rises and falls, rises and falls, again and again. Each strike carries weight, not just from the tool itself, but from the repetition behind it. The force required is not extreme in a single moment, but over time. It accumulates, it settles into the shoulders, into the arms, into the back that remains steady through every movement. The apprentice begins to feel it more clearly now, not as a sudden exhaustion, but as a quiet fatigue that lingers and slowly grows. Holding the tongs for longer periods becomes more difficult, maintaining grip requires more attention, even standing in place begins to feel different. The legs shift slightly, seeking small moments of relief that never fully arrive, and yet the work continues, because there is no point in the day where effort is no longer required. There is only variation, moments of heavier strain, followed by moments that feel slightly lighter, but never truly restful. Even the simplest tasks carry weight: lifting charcoal, moving tools, adjusting the bellows. Each action, repeated over hours, becomes part of a larger demand placed upon the body, and slowly the understanding deepens. Strength is not measured by how much can be lifted once, it is measured by how long the work can continue without breaking. The blacksmith knows this well. His movements conserve energy without appearing to do so. Each strike is controlled, never wasted. Each step is deliberate, never unnecessary. There is an efficiency in the way he works, not born from ease, but from necessity, because without it, the body would not endure the day. The apprentice watches closely, not just the shaping of metal, but the way effort is managed. The way the blacksmith pauses, not fully stopping, but shifting weight, adjusting grip, allowing brief moments of recovery within the rhythm itself. These small adjustments, almost invisible, are what make continuation possible. Without them, the strain would become too much. Too quickly. The forge does not allow for long breaks. There is no extended moment of rest where the body can fully recover, only brief spaces between tasks, moments where the hammer is lowered, where the hands release their grip, where breath is taken more deeply, before the next cycle begins again. And so endurance becomes something quiet, not declared, not displayed, but present in every continued movement. As the hours pass, the weight becomes more noticeable, not heavier than before, but more persistent, less ignorable. The arms respond more slowly, the shoulders hold tension longer, the back begins to carry the day's work in a way that cannot be easily set aside. And still, the blacksmith continues, not forcing, not rushing, but enduring, because stopping completely is not an option that easily exists here. The apprentice begins to understand, this work is not about moments of strength, it is about remaining steady, even when strength begins to fade, even when the body asks for pause, and the rhythm does not allow it. There is a quiet resilience in this, one that is built slowly, through repetition, through time, through the simple act of continuing again and again. And as the fire burns steadily, unchanged by the passing hours, another truth begins to settle in. The hardest part of this life is not learning how to do the work, it is learning how to keep going, long after the body begins to feel it. Before the eye fully understands the workshop, before the heat settles into the skin, before the weight of the work is felt in the arms, there is sound, always sound. The forge speaks in a language that does not stop. It does not rise and fall like conversation, it does not wait for silence, it simply continues. Lead. Constant. Alive in its own rhythm. At the center of it all is the hammer. A single strike is clear, distinct, it cuts through the air with purpose, meeting iron on iron, and then fading just slightly before the next begins. But it never remains alone, because the forge does not produce a single sound at a time, it produces many, overlapping, blending, forming a kind of steady atmosphere that fills every space within the workshop. The bellows breathe, a slow wooden creak accompanies each movement, in and out, not mechanical, but heavy with effort. Each push of air feeds the fire, and with that feeding comes a soft rise in sound. The fire responding in subtle shifts of crackle and movement. The flames themselves are not silent, they whisper, not loudly, but constantly, a low, uneven crackling that changes depending on what is being burned, where the heat is strongest, how the metal is reacting within it, and beneath it all. There is iron, not yet shaped, not yet complete, but speaking in its own way, a faint ringing when struck, a deeper tone when placed on the anvil, a sharp resonance that fades slowly into the air. Each material has its own voice here. Wood creaks, metal rings, fire hisses, stone absorbs everything without reply. The blacksmith does not try to silence these sounds. He works within them, guided by them, because over time, the sounds become instruction, the difference between a correct strike and a misplaced one can often be heard before it is seen. A clean ring suggests alignment, a dull thud suggests correction is needed. Even the fire changes its voice depending on temperature, intensity, readiness, and so listening becomes part of the craft, not as background awareness, but as active attention. The apprentice learns this slowly. At first, the sounds feel overwhelming, too many layers at once, too difficult to separate, but gradually, patterns begin to emerge, the hammer becomes familiar, the rhythm of striking begins to repeat in predictable cycles. The bellows settle into a steady breath, even the silence between actions becomes meaningful. Not empty, there are moments in the workshop where sound briefly thins, not disappears, but softens. During those moments, everything feels suspended, as if the space itself is holding its breath. Then, the next strike arrives, and the world fills again. The workshop is never truly quiet, even when no hammer is falling. There is still the subtle presence of fire, even when the fire is still. There is the faint shift of air, the movement of tools, the distant sounds from outside the workshop reaching in only faintly, but inside, they are always partially absorbed, muted, filtered. As if the forge exists in its own enclosed world of sound, the blacksmith moves within it without resistance. He does not appear distracted by it. He does not react to each sound individually. Instead, he listens for meaning within it, a deeper awareness that guides action without needing explanation. The apprentice begins to notice this too, that the workshop is not chaotic. Even if it sounds busy, there is order within it, structure, a rhythm that repeats in cycles so consistent that, once understood, it becomes easier to follow than silence. But learning this takes time, because at first, everything feels equal, every sound seems important, every noise seems to demand attention. Only later does distinction appear, which sounds matter in the moment, and which simply exist as background to the process. The forge teaches this slowly, not through instruction, but through repetition, through hours of listening while working, through noticing what happens immediately after each sound. The hammer falls, and something changes, the bellows move, and the fire responds. The metal is struck, and its tone reveals its state. Nothing is random, everything communicates, and over time, the workshop becomes less like a noisy place, and more like a conversation that never stops, a conversation between fire, metal, air, and motion, and the blacksmith stands within it, not speaking over it, but responding to it, strike after strike, breath after breath, sound after sound, until the entire space becomes one continuous rhythm that never truly ends. Before the fire is seen, before the hammer is heard, before the heat is felt against the skin, there is something else, something invisible, but never absent, the smell of the forge. It does not announce itself like sound, it does not demand attention like heat, it simply arrives, and stays. At first, it is faint, a trace in the air near the workshop entrance, something metallic, sharp, almost dry. Mixed with it is smoke, not clean smoke from wood alone, but heavier, older, layered with the residue of repeated burning. Together, they form a scent that belongs only here and nowhere else. Feels quite like it. Inside the workshop, the air is never neutral, it carries memory. Every piece of iron that has been heated leaves something behind, not visible, but present. Every flame that has burned contributes to it, every hour of work adds another layer, and so the air becomes part of the craft itself. The blacksmith does not notice it in the way an outsider would. For him, it is constant, familiar, it is the background of every task. The apprentice, however, notices everything at first. Stepping closer to the forge means stepping into a heavier atmosphere. The smell grows stronger near the fire. It clings to clothing quickly, settles into fabric, into skin, into hair. It does not fade easily. even when leaving the workshop for a short time. It follows, a reminder of where the day has been spent. The scent of heated iron is not pleasant in a traditional sense. It is not meant to be. It is sharp, dry, slightly bitter. It carries the feeling of something being transformed under extreme conditions, something changed permanently. Alongside it is the smoke, not thick enough to obscure vision, but present enough to shape the air. It moves slowly through the workshop, rising in soft streams, then spreading thinly near the ceiling before disappearing into small openings above. It carries warmth with it, not physical warmth, but a suggestion of it, a memory of fire passing through space. There are moments when the wind outside shifts, and the smoke inside shifts with it. A subtle change in direction, a gentle movement that briefly alters how the air feels in the room. These changes are small, but noticeable to those who spend enough time here. Over time, the blacksmith learns to ignore the discomfort of the smell, not because it disappears, but because it becomes part of the environment, like the sound of the hammer, like the glow of the fire. It is simply there, always present. The apprentice takes longer to adjust. At first, it feels overwhelming. The combination of smoke, heat, and metal creates an atmosphere that feels dense, almost tangible. Breathing becomes something more noticeable. Each inhale carries the forge into the body. Each exhale releases it again, but only partially, because it never fully leaves. Even the tools seem to hold the scent. Handles worn smooth by years of use carry faint traces of smoke. Metal surfaces warmed repeatedly by fire seem to retain something of it even when cold. The workshop becomes layered with this invisible presence, not dirty, not unpleasant in a simple way, but deeply tied to the work itself. There are rare moments when the forge is quiet, when no metal is being heated, when no fire is actively roaring. Even then, the smell remains, lingering in corners, resting in wood, held within stone, as if the space itself has absorbed it over time. The blacksmith works within it without resistance. The apprentice learns to do the same, and slowly, something changes in perception. What once felt strong becomes normal. What once felt overwhelming becomes familiar, not weaker, just understood differently. The smell of smoke no longer signals discomfort, it signals presence, the presence of work being done, of fire being used, of metal being shaped. It becomes part of the identity of the space, and perhaps part of the people within it, because long after leaving the workshop, long after the fire has been extinguished for the day, the scent still remains faintly on the hands, on the clothes, on the memory, a quiet reminder that some places do not simply fade when you leave them. They stay with you, in ways that are not always visible. And as the forge continues its steady cycle of heat and work, the air itself becomes another tool, not shaped by hand, but shaped by time. As the day moves forward, the light outside begins to shift slowly, but inside the workshop, the change is harder to notice. There is no clear boundary here, no clean break between morning and afternoon, only continuation. The forge does not mark time in hours, it marks time in cycles: heat, shape, return, heat, shape, return, and within that rhythm, hours begin to blend together. At first, the body still recognizes the passage of time. There are moments of awareness, a sense that the morning has ended, that the day has moved forward, that something has changed outside the walls, but the work does not reflect it. The fire remains steady, the hammer continues its pattern. The tools are still used in the same order, for the same purposes, without interruption, and slowly, those external markers begin to lose meaning. Inside the workshop, time becomes something else entirely, not measured by sunlight, but by endurance. The blacksmith continues without pause, not because there is no need to rest, but because the work does not pause with him. There is always another piece waiting, another repair needed, another shape unfinished, and so stopping becomes something delayed, not avoided, but postponed again and again. A short moment here, a brief pause there, but never a full rest. The apprentice notices this shift most clearly. In the beginning, there is an expectation that work will break at some point into silence, that there will be a natural stopping point, a moment where tools are set down and the body is allowed to recover fully, but that moment does not arrive easily. Instead, the rhythm continues without clear conclusion. Even between tasks, there is preparation. Even between preparation, there is anticipation. The forge does not empty itself of demand, it only shifts what is required as the hours stretch further. The sense of fatigue becomes more subtle, not sharp, not sudden, but continuous. It settles in the body like a quiet pressure that does not leave. The arms feel heavier when raised, the hands take slightly longer to respond, the back holds tension that does not fully release even when standing still, but there is no single moment that signals rest is needed, only gradual awareness. The blacksmith does not appear to fight against this, he moves within it, adjusting without breaking rhythm, taking small pauses where possible, but never stepping fully away. Even rest, here, is partial. A brief lowering of tools, a slow breath. Near the edge of the forge, a moment of stillness that lasts just long enough to continue. The apprentice begins to understand that rest is not absent, it is simply fragmented, distributed across the day in small pieces that never fully restore what has been used. Outside the workshop, the world continues its own rhythm. Shadows shift across the ground. The position of the sun changes. People move through the village in cycles of their own, but inside, those changes feel distant, muted, almost irrelevant, because everything within the forge is measured differently, not by how much time has passed, but by how much remains to be done, and that amount never feels small. There is always another request, another repair, another task placed gently at the edge of the anvil. Each one extending the day just slightly further, not dramatically, but enough to prevent completion, enough to keep the rhythm going, and so the idea of ending begins to fade, not disappear completely, but soften. It becomes less like a fixed point, and more like a possibility that may or may not arrive. The blacksmith does not speak of finishing, he speaks only through continuation, through action, through the steady return of hammer to metal. And as the apprentice follows this rhythm more closely, they begin to realize something quietly unsettling. The day does not naturally end here, it only stops when it is finally allowed to, and that decision is never entirely clear, because the forge, even in stillness, feels like it is waiting, not for rest, but for the next piece of work, and so the hours continue, not broken, not divided, just extended, until they become something else entirely, something closer to endurance than time. The forge does not change its rhythm, even when the body is tired, even when the hours feel long, even when attention begins to thin at the edges. The fire continues exactly as before, steady, unbothered, unaware, but the human body is not like the fire. It does not remain constant under pressure, it reacts, it slips, it hesitates. At the wrong moment, and in a place where heat, iron, and timing exist so closely together, even a small mistake can carry consequence. The blacksmith understands this without needing to be reminded, not as fear, but as awareness, a quiet, always present understanding that every movement must remain deliberate, because the tools do not forgive carelessness. A hammer does not correct its own path once it falls, a piece of heated iron does not wait if it is released too soon, and the fire does not slow down to match hesitation. Within the workshop, danger is not dramatic, it is subtle, it exists in the smallest moments, a shifting grip that happens too late, a moment of distraction while metal is still glowing, a tool placed slightly off balance near the edge of the anvil. These are not rare events in a life of constant repetition, they are possibilities. Always present, always nearby. The apprentice learns this slowly, not through instruction alone, but through near mistakes, a slip of a tong that is caught just in time, a piece of metal that shifts slightly too close to the hand, a moment where instinct reacts before thought. Each incident is small, almost invisible afterward, but they leave an impression that does not fade quickly. There is no loud warning when something goes wrong, only the immediate realization that it could have been worse. The blacksmith works through these moments without pause, correcting, adjusting, continuing. There is no space in the rhythm for extended reaction, because stopping too long in response to risk creates its own danger. The fire remains active, the metal remains hot, the work remains unfinished, and so movement continues, carefully but continuously. Over time, the body develops a kind of awareness that does not rely on thought. Hands are just before the mind fully processes. Feet shift slightly to maintain balance without conscious decision. Eyes track heat, movement, and position simultaneously. It becomes a state of constant attention, spread across many small points at once, but even with experience, risk never disappears. The forge is not a controlled environment in the modern sense. It is a working space built around forces that are always active. Fire does not become safe, it becomes familiar. Metal does not become harmless, it becomes predictable within limits, and those limits are never absolute. There are moments when sparks rise unexpectedly, tiny fragments of heated metal that separate during shaping. They do not travel far, but they move quickly enough to remind the body that even small things carry energy. There are moments when tools shift under pressure, when weight is misjudged for a fraction of a second, when alignment is slightly off, and correction must happen instantly. These are not dramatic events, but they require constant readiness. The blacksmith does not dwell on these risks. Dwelling slows reaction, creates hesitation, and hesitation is the one thing the forge does not accommodate easily. Instead, awareness becomes part of the rhythm, not separate from it. The apprentice begins to understand this distinction over time, that safety here is not a fixed condition, it is a continuous practice, maintained moment by moment, through attention, through discipline, through repetition done correctly. Many times in a row, injuries, when they occur, are rarely catastrophic. More often, they are small, heat too close for too long, a momentary burn, a bruise from impact, a cut from a tool misaligned in motion. Each one is acknowledged briefly, then managed. There is no space for extended interruption, but there is recognition, a quiet reminder that the environment is not forgiving. It does not intend harm, but it does not prevent it either. As the day continues, the blacksmith's movements remain steady, not cautious to the point of hesitation, but precise enough to avoid unnecessary risk. There is a difference between fear and awareness. One interrupts work, the other supports it, and within this space, awareness is the only reliable guide, because the forge does not pause for uncertainty, it only responds to action. And so every movement, no matter how routine, carries within it a quiet responsibility to remain steady, to remain present, to remain aware that even in a place of rhythm and repetition, the smallest lapse is enough to change everything. The forge remains the same, even when everything outside it changes. That is one of its quietest truths. Inside, the fire burns steadily, its glow constant, its heat unchanged in purpose, but beyond the workshop walls, the world shifts without concern for the work inside. Seasons move, weather turns, cold arrives without warning, then lingers longer than expected, and still the forge continues. In winter, the air outside can feel sharp enough to slow movement before it even begins. Wood creaks more heavily, stone holds a deeper cold. Even breathing feels different the moment one steps away from the fire, but inside the workshop, that cold does not survive for long. The heat pushes against it, not violently, but persistently, as if the forge refuses to allow the outside world to fully enter, and yet it does not remove it entirely, because the blacksmith still feels the contrast, the moment of stepping away from the fire toward the door brings a sudden shift. Warmth gives way to cold air in an instant, a reminder that the comfort of the forge is never permanent, it must be returned to. In summer, the feeling is different, the air already carries weight, not from cold, but from stillness. Heat exists both inside and outside now. Blending in ways that make the boundaries less clear, the forge no longer feels like a source of contrast, but of continuation. The work does not become easier in any season, it only changes shape. In colder months, materials behave differently. Metal cools faster once removed from the fire. Timing becomes more precise, movements must adjust. In warmer months, the body carries more strain, sweat forms earlier in the day, breath feels heavier even before the first major task begins, but the rhythm remains unchanged. Fire still needs tending. Metal still needs shaping, tools still need to be used in the same order, with the same attention. The apprentice begins to notice that there is no ideal condition for the work, only variation, only adjustment. The blacksmith does not comment on weather in the way others might, it is acknowledged, but not resisted, because resistance does not change it, adaptation does. Rain sometimes taps against the outer walls of the workshop, soft at first, then steady. The sound becomes part of the background rhythm of the day. Inside, the fire continues unaffected, but the atmosphere changes slightly. The air feels denser, more enclosed, as if the outside world has moved closer for a short time, before being pushed back again by heat. On windy days, small drafts find their way into corners of the workshop. Not strong enough to disturb the forge, but enough to remind those inside that nothing here is completely sealed off. Even stone has limits, even fire shares space with air, and so the blacksmith works within all of it, not waiting for perfect conditions, not pausing for ideal weather, but continuing through whatever arrives. The apprentice learns that adaptation is not occasional, it is constant. Every season requires subtle adjustment, every shift in temperature changes how materials behave. Every change in environment affects the body in small but noticeable ways, and yet the work remains the same. That is the most important part, not consistency of conditions, but consistency of purpose. There are days when sunlight enters the workshop at a lower angle, stretching across the floor in long, slow shapes, days when fog settles outside, making the world beyond the doorway feel distant and muted, days when the air inside feels almost completely still, as if even movement itself has slowed slightly. But inside the forge, none of these changes interrupt the rhythm. The hammer still rises, the bellows still move, the fire still answers. The blacksmith adapts quietly to each shift without breaking flow, because stopping for conditions would mean stopping often, and the work does not allow for that. Over time, this creates a deeper understanding in the apprentice that comfort is not part of the craft, not in the way people might assume. There is no ideal temperature, no perfect moment, only the ability to continue regardless of what surrounds the workshop. And as that understanding settles in, something else becomes clear. The forge does not exist separate from the world outside, it exists within it, responding to it, enduring it, and shaping work through it, just as much as it shapes the people who work inside it. And so the seasons continue to change, the weather continues to shift, but inside the forge, the fire remains steady, not because the world is stable, but because the work refuses to stop for it. The forge does not belong only to the blacksmith, not really. It only appears that way from the inside, because beyond its walls, beyond the heat and smoke and steady rhythm of hammering, there is a world that quietly depends on it, not in obvious ways, not in ways that are always spoken aloud, but in ways that reveal themselves only when something breaks. A tool cracks in the middle of harvest, a hinge fails on a door that must remain closed through the night, a horse loses a shoe on a road far from home. These are small failures, simple ones, but in a medieval world, small failures do not stay small for long, they spread outward, slowly, quietly, until they become disruption. The blacksmith's work exists to prevent that spreading, to hold those small fractures before they grow into larger problems. Inside the forge, this responsibility feels routine, another piece of iron, another repair, another shape restored. But outside, It is something else entirely. A farmer does not think of the hammer striking metal, he thinks of the plough that must return to the field. A merchant does not think of heat and fire, he thinks of a cart that must continue its journey. A traveler does not think of the forge itself, only of the shoe that must be replaced before the road becomes impossible. And yet, all of them eventually arrive at the same place, not because they seek the blacksmith specifically, but because they must. The forge becomes a point of return, a place where broken things are made usable again, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to continue. Inside the workshop, the blacksmith rarely speaks of importance. It is not something that needs explanation here, it is visible in the flow of work, in the constant arrival of needs, in the way tools never remain still. For long, the apprentice begins to notice it first through repetition. Certain items appear again and again, similar repairs, familiar shapes, common problems that return in different forms. A bent blade, a worn edge, a broken link in something that once held together. Nothing is unusual, but everything is necessary, and over time, a pattern emerges. The forge is not just a place of repair, it is a place of continuity, a place that keeps daily life from breaking apart completely. Without it, even simple tasks would begin to fail, and failure, in this world, does not remain isolated. A broken tool can delay a harvest, a delayed harvest can affect a household. A household affected can ripple outward into the village. The blacksmith understands this not through theory, but through experience, through seeing the same items return in different hands, through recognizing the urgency behind simple requests, through noticing how quickly something becomes important when it stops working. But this understanding does not create pressure in the way one might expect, it creates focus, because importance here is not abstract, it is practical. It arrives in the form of objects placed on the anvil, not speeches, not expectations, just need. The forge responds to that need in the only way it knows, through heat, through shaping, through repair. There is no ceremony in it, no declaration of significance, only continuation of function. The apprentice begins to understand this balance, that importance is not always visible in the moment of creation, sometimes it is only recognized in the absence of it, when something is missing, when something breaks, when something cannot continue without intervention, and the blacksmith's role sits quietly within that space, not as someone elevated above others, but as someone positioned where interruption becomes repair, where failure becomes restoration, where brokenness becomes temporary instead of final. Outside, life continues without constant awareness of this dependency. It is not always thought about, not always acknowledged, but it is always there, hidden in background expectation, that when something stops working, there is somewhere to take it, and someone who will know what to do with it. Inside the forge, the fire burns steadily, not as a symbol, not as a statement, but as a tool for continuity. And as the day moves forward, with more items arriving, more repairs requested, more quiet exchanges at the doorway, the blacksmith continues without pause. Because importance here is not something carried as pride, it is something carried as work. The forge stands in a quiet corner of the village, but its reach is never truly small. From the outside, it looks like just another workshop, stone walls, a dark doorway, a faint glow that appears stronger at certain hours of the day, but over time, it becomes something more, not by declaration, but by repetition. People come and go from it constantly, not in crowds, not in chaos, but in a steady, familiar flow that never fully stops. A farmer arrives in the morning with a broken plough. Later, a child is sent with a small metal repair wrapped in cloth. By midday, a traveler leads a tired horse toward the door, waiting quietly for help. None of them treat the visit as unusual. It is simply part of how things are done when something fails. It is brought here, inside the workshop. The blacksmith does not see these arrivals as interruptions. They are expected, as natural as the fire itself, and because of that, the forge becomes something the village quietly organizes itself around. Not formally, not consciously, but practically, Fields are tended knowing tools will eventually need repair. Journeys are planned knowing wheels might fail along the way. Doors are built knowing hinges will wear out and return someday for fixing. The blacksmith becomes part of the village's timing. Even without directly controlling it, the apprentice begins to notice this pattern slowly. It is not just individual people arriving, it is the same kinds of needs returning in different forms, the same problems appearing again and again. Carried by different hands, and each time, they are accepted without surprise. There is no judgment in it, only recognition, inside the forge. The rhythm continues as always: heat, shape, repair, return, but outside. Something larger forms quietly, a network of reliance that is never fully spoken about, a shared understanding that certain things only happen in one place. The forge becomes a point of correction, a place where small failures are not ignored or discarded, but restored enough to continue, not perfectly, not permanently, but sufficiently, and that is enough. The villagers do not usually stay long inside the workshop. They arrive with purpose and leave once it is fulfilled, but even in short visits, they become part of the forge's rhythm. Their presence adds variation to the day, different requests, different objects, different urgencies, and yet all of them return to the same process: fire, metal, hammer, repair. There is a quiet trust built into this exchange, not spoken, not formal, but visible in how little explanation is needed. A broken tool is placed down, a nod is exchanged, and work begins. Outside, life continues in cycles that depend on this hidden support. Harvests are possible because tools return, journeys continue because wheels are fixed. Homes remain functional because small failures do not accumulate beyond repair. And so the forge becomes less of a location, and more of a condition within the village, a steady presence that holds certain parts of life together without drawing attention to itself. The blacksmith rarely speaks about this dependence. It is not necessary. It is already understood through action, through repetition, through the constant return of needs. The apprentice begins to see the village differently over time, not as separate from the forge, but as something loosely connected to it, a system of movement that passes through the workshop at certain points, then moves outward again, and at the center of it all, the forge remains steady, not reacting to the importance placed upon it, not changing its rhythm for recognition, only continuing its work, because that is what it exists to do. And as the day moves forward, and villagers come and go, and repaired items are carried away again into the world, the blacksmith returns to the fire each time without hesitation, not as someone isolated from the village, but as someone quietly holding part of it together, one repair at a time. At the end of each task, there is a small moment of exchange, not always loud, not always immediate, but always present. The blacksmith finishes a repair, sets the cooled metal aside, and waits as the person who brought it steps forward. Sometimes it is coin, small, worn pieces of metal that change hands quickly and quietly. Sometimes it is trade, grain, cloth, wood, simple things, exchanged not in markets, but at the doorway of the forge. There is no ceremony in it, no formal pricing spoken aloud for each object. Over time, understanding replaces negotiation. People know what is fair, the blacksmith knows what is enough, and so the exchange becomes brief, efficient, almost invisible in its simplicity, but behind it lies something more important than the item itself. It is what allows the day to continue. The forge does not produce abundance in the way fields do. It does not gather harvest. It does not store wealth in large amounts. Instead, it creates continuity, small payments, gathered slowly, enough to sustain the next day's work, enough to buy coal, enough to maintain tools, enough to live without interruption. The apprentice begins to notice how modest this life really is. There is no accumulation of excess, no visible stockpile of wealth, only what is needed. As it is needed, the blacksmith's daily life reflects this same simplicity. Work, repair, receive, repeat. Meals are taken in between tasks. Not as long breaks, but as necessary pauses. Bread, soup, whatever is available at the time, eaten quickly enough to return to the forge before the rhythm fully breaks. Rest is not a separate part of the day, it is woven into it in small fragments. A moment of sitting near the edge of the workshop, a brief pause while metal cools, a short silence after a task is completed. Even sleep, when it comes, is shaped by the memory of repetition. The body does not fully leave the rhythm, it carries it into rest. The apprentice begins to understand that this life does not separate work from living in the way some might expect. They are not two different states, they are intertwined. The forge is not something entered and exited cleanly, it extends into everything, even outside the workshop. Traces of it remain, on hands, on clothing, on thought. The blacksmith does not appear concerned with accumulation, there is no desire for more than what is required. Instead, there is focus on continuity, as long as the fire can be maintained, as long as tools remain functional, as long as the next day can begin without interruption, then the system holds. Payment is not viewed as reward, it is viewed as support for continuation, a means to keep the cycle intact. The apprentice sees how little waste exists in this life. Broken materials are rarely discarded completely, they are reshaped, reused, repaired. Even failures become part of future work. Nothing is fully removed from the system unless it is entirely unusable. And even then, it is considered carefully before being set aside. There is a quiet efficiency in everything, not rushed, not forceful, but deeply intentional. The blacksmith does not speak often about money or trade, it is not a central concern in the way outsiders might assume. What matters more is whether the next day can begin as the previous one did, with fire, with tools, with work waiting. The apprentice begins to realize that survival here is not built on accumulation, it is built on rhythm, on steady exchange, on the ability to maintain balance between what is taken in and what is given out. There is no sharp division between wealth and labor, only flow. Coins come in, materials are used, repairs are made, and life continues, quietly, without excess, without disruption, as the day moves forward. Villagers come and go as always, each leaving something behind, each taking something repaired away, and through it all, the forge remains constant, not growing, not shrinking, only continuing, and the blacksmith, in his quiet way, remains at the center of that balance, not as someone accumulating more than others, but as someone ensuring that what exists continues to function, one exchange at a time. The forge does not change quickly, but the body does, not in sudden ways, not in ways that are immediately visible, but slowly, almost invisibly. Over time, what begins as simple effort in the early years, a strong back, steady arms, reliable hands, gradually becomes something else, something shaped by repetition. The blacksmith does not notice the change at first. There is no moment where strength suddenly disappears, no clear point where endurance becomes weakness, only small differences accumulated quietly. A hammer that once felt balanced now carries slightly more weight on the return. A movement that once felt effortless now requires a fraction more attention. A stance that once held naturally now demands subtle adjustment. The apprentice, still early in the craft, does not see this yet. To them, the blacksmith still appears steady, controlled, unchanged, but time within the forge is not measured in appearance, it is measured in strain, in the body's quiet response to years of repetition. The shoulders begin to carry memory, not emotional memory, but physical memory of every strike, every lift, every hour spent holding position near the heat. The back, once simply supportive, becomes something that must be managed, not with complaint, but with awareness. Certain movements become more deliberate, not slower out of weakness, but out of necessity. Efficiency becomes more important than speed. Waste of motion becomes something the body avoids on its own. Even breathing begins to adapt, not in difficulty, but in rhythm, in timing that aligns with work rather than rest. The forge does not allow long pauses for recovery, so recovery becomes something scattered, small moments, spread throughout the day. Never fully complete, the apprentice begins to notice small signs, the way the blacksmith shifts weight slightly between tasks, the brief pause before lifting heavier tools, the way hands sometimes flex without purpose after long periods of grip. None of these are spoken about, they are not presented as problems, they are simply part of continuation. Because the work does not stop, and so the body learns to continue with it. There are days when fatigue settles more deeply than others, not dramatically, but persistently, the kind of tiredness that does not disappear overnight. It carries forward, softly influencing the next day's movement. Yet the forge demands consistency. The rhythm does not adjust for discomfort, it continues regardless. Fire still needs tending, metal still needs shaping. And so the blacksmith adapts. Again, not by resisting the toll, but by working within it. There is a quiet acceptance in this stage of life, not resignation, but understanding that nothing in this work remains unchanged forever. Not even the body that performs it. The apprentice, observing more closely now, begins to see the difference between strength and endurance. Strength is immediate, visible. Endurance is gradual, invisible, and it is endurance that defines this life over time, as years accumulate. The forge becomes less about force and more about efficiency. Every movement refined, every unnecessary motion removed. What remains is only what is essential. This refinement is not taught. It is learned through necessity, through repetition that leaves no room for excess. The blacksmith does not speak of aging. It is not marked as a separate idea within the workshop. There is no division between before and after. Only continuity, only adaptation, only change so slow it becomes part of the background. Even the fire reflects this sense of continuity. It does not burn differently for those who tend it over many years. It remains constant, unaware of the passage of time outside its own rhythm, and yet it witnesses everything. As the blacksmith continues through the day, there are moments when stillness feels different than it once did, not heavier, not slower, just more present. A pause between actions carries more awareness than it used to. A moment of rest holds more weight simply because it is recognized as necessary. But even these moments do not interrupt the work, they exist within it, and so the forge continues to shape not only metal, but the person who works within it, not through sudden change, but through accumulation, through years of repetition that slowly rewrite what the body considers normal. And as the apprentice watches this unfold, they begin to understand something that cannot be taught directly. That this life does not take everything at once, it takes it slowly, carefully, one movement at a time, until even change itself feels natural. Even a life built on repetition is not entirely without pause. But here, pause does not mean rest in the usual sense. It does not mean separation from the work. It exists inside it, between movements, between tasks, between one completed repair and the next piece placed on the anvil. These moments are not planned, they do not arrive with certainty, they simply appear. Briefly. Before the rhythm resumes again, the forge, in those small gaps, feels different, not silent, never truly silent, but softened. The hammer is no longer striking, the bellows are still, the fire continues, but without fresh movement feeding it, its sound becomes gentler, more contained. The air does not change completely, but it settles slightly, as if the workshop itself is taking a slower breath. In these intervals, the blacksmith does not leave the space. He remains close to it, near the anvil, near the fire, not stepping away fully, because the work is never truly finished, but not actively engaged either. Hands rest for a moment. Tools are set down carefully, not dropped or abandoned. There is a quiet precision even in stopping. The apprentice notices these moments most clearly at first, not because they are long, but because they feel unfamiliar. within the steady rhythm of labor, even a short pause becomes noticeable. It creates a contrast that did not exist before, a brief space where nothing is being shaped. Nothing is being struck, nothing is being adjusted, and in that space, awareness shifts slightly outward, to the sound of the fire, to the weight of the air, to the presence of the workshop itself without immediate action happening inside it. The blacksmith does not use these moments for reflection in the way someone outside might imagine. There is no dramatic pause for thought. No separation from the craft. Instead, there is a kind of quiet readiness, a state of being between actions, not fully resting, not fully working, just prepared, as if the next movement is already understood, even before it begins. Outside the workshop, life continues in its own rhythm. Footsteps pass by the entrance, distant voices carry through the air, light shifts slightly as clouds move overhead, but inside, these changes feel distant, almost secondary, because attention remains close to the forge. Even in stillness, the apprentice begins to understand that these pauses are not interruptions, they are part of the structure. Without them, the rhythm would not be sustainable. Even fire requires moments where it is not being actively fed, even metal requires time to cool between stages of shaping, and even the body requires brief relief between efforts, but none of these pauses exist independently, they are woven into the process itself, not separate from it. The blacksmith uses these moments without drawing attention to them, a slow adjustment of stance, a brief shift of weight, a glance toward the tools before the next task begins. Everything is minimal, nothing is wasted, even rest is efficient. There is a kind of quiet intelligence in this way of working, not expressed in words, but in timing, in knowing when to act and when to wait. Even if that waiting is only for a few breaths, the apprentice learns that these moments cannot be forced, they cannot be extended artificially, they exist only as part of the flow, and trying to hold onto them too long would disrupt what comes after, so they are experienced as they are, briefly, naturally, and then released as the rhythm resumes, as the next piece of metal is placed, as the fire is adjusted again, as the hammer rises once more. The forge returns to motion without hesitation, but something subtle remains from the pause, a slight recalibration, a momentary reset that allows the work to continue without collapse. And over time, these quiet gaps become essential, not as escape, but as structure within endurance, a reminder that even in continuous labor, there are still spaces where the world softens just enough to breathe differently, and then continues again. There comes a stage in this work where instruction no longer feels separate from action. What once required attention now happens almost naturally, not without thought, but without hesitation. The blacksmith no longer approaches each task as something uncertain. The fire is read without effort. The metal is understood without needing to question it. The tools are chosen without delay. Everything has settled into place through repetition so long that it no longer feels new, but that does not mean it has become simple. It has become refined. There is a difference. Skill here is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is not displayed in sudden moments of brilliance. Instead, it appears in the absence of error, in movements that do not waste energy, in timing that feels aligned with the work itself. The hammer rises and falls with consistency that no longer needs correction. The blacksmith does not think about each strike in isolation. He thinks in sequence, in flow, in continuation. The apprentice, now more experienced, begins to move in the same rhythm, not copying anymore, but understanding. The earlier confusion has faded, replaced by recognition. What once felt complex now feels structured, not because the work has changed, but because perception has changed. There is discipline in everything here, not imposed discipline, but internal discipline, the kind that forms over time without being spoken about. It exists in how tools are placed back in their exact positions after use, in how fire is maintained without unnecessary fluctuation, in how movement is reduced to what is needed. And nothing more, nothing in the forge is excessive when mastery begins to take shape. Even silence between actions becomes meaningful, not empty, but controlled. The blacksmith does not rush. but he does not hesitate either. That balance is what defines this stage of work. Each action is connected to the next in a way that feels continuous rather than separate. The apprentice learns that discipline is not restriction, it is clarity. It removes uncertainty from movement, it removes confusion from timing, it allows attention to remain fully within the task instead of scattered around it, and with that clarity comes a different kind of calm, not the calm of rest, but the calm of knowing exactly what must be done. And when the forge no longer feels unpredictable, not because it has changed, but because understanding has deepened, fire behaves in known ways, metal responds within expected ranges, tools become extensions of intention rather than obstacles to it. There is still effort, there is still heat, there is still repetition that stretches through the day. But now, it is carried with less friction. The blacksmith does not resist the work, he moves with it. As if both have reached agreement over time, the apprentice begins to notice how little is said now during work. Instructions are no longer frequent, corrections are rare. Most communication happens through movement, a shift of position, a glance toward the fire, a change in pace that signals adjustment without needing words. This quiet communication becomes its own language, understood through experience rather than explanation, and within it, the workshop feels even more contained, more focused, more settled into its own rhythm. Outside, the world still changes, but inside, that change feels less disruptive, because discipline creates consistency within variation. The forge does not resist the world, it absorbs it and continues anyway. There is a point where skill stops feeling like something acquired and starts feeling like something embodied, not learned recently, but lived, carried, maintained, and in that state, the blacksmith does not think of himself as skilled, he simply continues. The apprentice, standing closer to that same understanding now, begins to realize something subtle, that mastery is not an endpoint, it is maintenance, a continuous act of preserving clarity in movement. Over and over, without letting it degrade into uncertainty. And so the forge continues, not as a place of struggle, but as a place of practiced discipline, where every action has been refined through time, until only what is necessary remains. By now, the forge feels less like a place of work, and more like a way of existing, not separate from life, but woven into it so deeply, that it is no longer questioned. The blacksmith stands as he always has, near the fire, near the anvil, near the tools that have been used so many times they feel less like objects and more like familiar extensions of movement itself. Nothing in the workshop feels new anymore, and yet nothing feels finished either. The fire continues its steady presence, not as something dramatic, but as something reliable. It does not demand attention, it simply remains, breathing in its own quiet rhythm. The apprentice, now no longer inexperienced, moves with that same rhythm, not perfectly, not completely without effort, but with understanding that was not there at the beginning. There is no longer a sense of urgency in every motion, no longer confusion in every task, only a steady continuation of what has already been learned. Through repetition that never fully announced its transformation. Outside, the world continues to change in ways that feel distant now. Days pass, seasons shift, people come and go, but inside the forge, those changes feel softened, not irrelevant, but filtered through the consistency of work that does not stop for them. There is a strange kind of peace in that, not silence, not escape, but stability built through repetition. The blacksmith does not speak often in these final moments. There is little need, the work itself carries everything that needs to be understood. The apprentice understands this now too, that much of what was once difficult was not only about strength, or skill, or endurance, but about learning to remain within the rhythm long enough for it to become familiar, long enough for it to stop feeling like effort, and start feeling like structure. The forge does not promise ease, it never did, but it offers something else in return: continuity, a steady cycle where broken things are made usable again, where effort becomes routine, where time becomes something that flows instead of interrupts, and in that cycle, life quietly settles, not into perfection, but into function. There is a final stillness in the workshop as the day slows, not an ending, just a soft reduction in motion, tools resting where they were last placed, fire glowing without urgency, air holding the warmth of everything that came before. The blacksmith looks at the forge not as something separate from himself, but as something he has moved with for a long time, and will continue to move with. As long as it remains necessary, the apprentice stands nearby, no longer distant, no longer observing from the edges, but present within it, part of it, and yet still aware of how long the path was to reach this point of understanding. Nothing about the forge feels like it has changed. But everything about perception has, because what once looked like repetition is now recognized as rhythm, what once felt like effort is now recognized as continuity, and what once seemed like simple labor is now seen as a quiet system that holds an entire way of life together. Not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, as the light outside begins to soften toward evening, the forge remains warm, not burning in urgency, but resting in readiness, and in that state, there is a question that lingers gently in the mind, not about how this work ends, but whether it ever truly does, because in a world like this, where repair is constant, and fire is always waiting, perhaps nothing is ever fully finished, only continued.